Good evening, everyone. It's your girl, Marcy Thomas, and I am delighted to be back with you for another episode of the BGC Book Club, as we are actually moving into our 5th year of providing content. I went back and looked at some of my old videos. I'm like, oh, we've come a long way, baby, as they used to say. So I consider it an honor to be here with you again and to be able to share one of our great authors who is just doing great things in the literary world. So if you don't know who I am, again, I'm Marcy Thomas, founder of Brown Girl Collective. The collective itself is almost 16 years old, but 5 years ago during the pandemic, I wanted to share my love of books with all of you, specifically books that are written by, for, and about us, and the us being Black women. So tonight, I am excited to talk to this young lady who we met a few years ago. I know she remembers how we met, but we were at a bookish event in DC, and I was talking to somebody, and she's like, I recognize your voice. And so ever since then, we've had a connection here in Atlanta, and I can't wait to talk to her about her latest release. So Katie Mitchell is our special guest, and she is a storyteller and a bookseller. She lives, works, and writes in Atlanta, Georgia. Her online and pop-up Black bookstore, which is called Good Books, has been featured in the New York Times, NBC, NPR, PBS, and many other outlets. And she is also a Dorothy Porter Wesley Fellow. Now, her new book, Prose to the People, a celebration of Black bookstores, was recently also featured in the New York Times just this past weekend. So I'm really excited for Katie and all the wonderful things that she's doing in the bookish space. So without any further delay, let's welcome her to BGC Book Club for the first and not the last time. All right. Welcome, Katie.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it is such a pleasure. So people always laugh when I tell them the story of how I met you. It's like, okay, she recognizes my voice. I guess it's a distinct voice. So
yes, a very lovely voice.
Thank you. So congratulations, first and foremost. This is pretty big to have this out in the world, and it's getting all kinds of buzz, New York Times and other places as well.
Yes, thank you. It's so exciting. I'm so glad it's getting a positive reception, and just that our stories are really resonating with folks.
Yes, and they definitely are. And I told you before we came on that the book is juicy to me. Juicy, because I am a book lover. I have been ever since being a little girl, going to the library and things like that, and not always having access to Black books. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's so juicy to me, because it's introducing something. I learned a lot in reading the book, and I'm sure others will as well. So how did you get started just with loving books in general? Where did that come from?
That definitely came from my mother, Catherine. She raised me and my brother to love Black books, Black people in general.
Right.
And I tell this story about, like when you're young and it's like, you need to clean your room, you need to wash the dishes, then you can go out and play. That wasn't the thing in my household. The thing was, you need to recite this Langston Hughes poem and you need to do it right, and then you can go out and play. So that was the type of household I was growing up in, just really steeped in Black literature and a love for the written word. And so she was the one who introduced that to me at a very young age.
Wow, I love that. And now my dad made me read. It wasn't necessarily Black literature, but he would make me read and write reports in the summertime, and I hated it then. But now, fast forward all these years, it did instill in me a love of reading. So now to love reading is one thing, and to decide that you want to open a bookstore, because you do have Good Books ATL, which is your digital or virtual bookstore and pop-up shop. Mm-hmm. What was it that made you and your mother decide to do that? Because that's a whole nother level.
Yeah, it's a different level. It started right after I graduated from college, and I had my first, big girl apartment in the city, and my friends came over, and had what I thought was a pretty regular bookshelf. I had Toni Morrison, it had Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and they were amazed by this bookshelf, and I was like, "What?" They're like, "Oh, I've never heard of this person." I was like, "You never heard of Toni Morrison?" And these were college educated people, but I went to a school that focused on engineering, so a lot of my classmates weren't really reading like that. Like maybe the last time they read a book for pleasure was in high school. And so I told my mom that story. I was at her house and we were eating breakfast and I told her that story and she said, "What if we opened a bookstore?" And it kind of just went so quickly from there. Like we wanted it to be mobile. We knew that we wanted to reintroduce people to a love of reading and to Black authors that they may have either forgotten about or never heard of in the case of some of my friends. So that's really how it started with me and my mom.
Wow. And what you said makes a lot of sense because kind of like I said, I wasn't reading a lot of Black authors coming up because I just wasn't aware of who all of them were.
Hmm.
So for a lot of us, a lot of people, it is kind of like being reintroduced or introduced to people that probably may not even be in the land of the living anymore, but they're
Right.
new to us.
Exactly.
So that's major.
Yeah, and that's what I love about Black literature.
Mhm.
We don't respect time. Like you said, you can find someone who's been gone way before you were even born,
Right.
and they're speaking to you directly. You're in their mind, and you're feeling the things that they're feeling, and they're putting these pictures in your head. So it's really like, to me, a spiritual experience and one that really transcends space and time when you're reading these words by folks that were thinking of you when they were writing them, even if you didn't exist yet.
Yes, and you're right. Thinking of us as they were writing because they dreamed a world, especially I'm thinking specifically of Octavia E. Butler,
Yeah.
but so many of our great authors, because there's things that happen in time that we are still dealing with. And they can give us answers or give us insight into how they may have dealt with different things throughout life, throughout history as being here in this nation or even around the world. And so
Absolutely.
there's so much that we can glean from them. So we go from a love of reading,
Uh-huh.
starting a bookstore, and now you've written this glorious, glorious book, Prose to the People. So,
Yeah.
what was it that made you decide that it was important to tell the stories about Black bookstores?
Yeah, I saw how transformative Black bookstores have been in my life, and I see them as transformative as the Black church or Black colleges, but I found that they were understudied, and I found it deeply ironic that this Black bookstores story hadn't been told in book form, because they hold our stories, but no one had told their stories yet. And so that's what set me on the journey of writing Prose to the People.
And it's such a good book. I knew it was going to be good. I'm going to turn to this first page because I mean, there are a lot of stories, there are anecdotes, there are interviews, there's history. But on this very first page, you all may not be able to, that's where you sign my book. I love it. But on this very first page is Walter Mosley,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I mentioned my dad before. He passed on 7 years ago, but Walter Mosley was his favorite writer. So the
Oh,
minute
wow.
I opened it and saw Walter Mosley, I'm like, oh, this is gonna be good.
And you know what? The story of that picture is really, I think, indicative of my whole process with Prose to the People. I got that picture from the archive of one of the Black booksellers in New York.
Okay.
And she sold her archive to the Schomburg, but she let me see it before they picked it up
Oh
because
wow.
the processing times for archives can be very slow. So she hooked me up and said, "I'll let you look at all this stuff before I give it to them." And so that helped the book so much. And I got that picture. I got like great anecdotes from her in her store and was able to really immerse myself in her store because she kept meticulous records. She was a
Yeah.
former Schomburg librarian, so she was really organized in that way. But just the generosity of elders and people who, didn't know me at the time, but we grew to have a really beautiful intergenerational friendship, really believing in the work and putting, themselves in it too. So that picture, I think that's why I put it there because I like always want to think about Glendorlin Johnson when I open Prose to the
I
People.
love that. I love that. And Well, I'll get into who wrote the forward for you here in a moment. But one of the other things that really jumped out at me was seeing, like, it's kind of hard because of the light, but seeing
Mhm.
Tina McElroy answer right there,
Yes.
who recently passed away last year, and I had an opportunity to interview her a couple of times. So I was like, oh, so those two things, I'm like, oh. No, I said I'm not even like 10 pages in, and I'm already hooked. I'm already
Hmm.
so thank you for that. But your introduction was written by someone else who is also now one of our ancestors, and that was Nikki Giovanni. So how did that come about that you were able to get her to write an introduction for you?
So when I was reporting Prose to the People, everyone had a story about Nikki Giovanni, and they were all positive. And I got other stories about other people that were not positive, but bookstores that were around from the 60s to I'd say the early 2000s all had a positive story about Nikki Giovanni. So it's really during the reporting process that I made the decision that I wanted her to have the first word in the first book about
Mhm.
Black bookstores. And so
Mhm.
I let her know that. I also just let her know what her work meant to me through different points in my life. And
Mhm.
I also let her know that, hey, Soror, we're both Delta, so hook
Okay.
me up. But she was so gracious. She was excited to be a part of it. She thanked me for asking her, which was like, and when I tell you, I was scared to edit Nikki Giovanni, but you know, she's
Mm.
a during this process, working with her, working with Pearl Clegg, with Paul Coates, they really showed me what it meant to be a good elder.
Mhm.
And then now that she's passed on, she's still showing me what it means to be a good ancestor, because lending her name to this project that is so important for our history to be told, and having Nikki Giovanni's name on this project is putting it in rooms that it might not have been in before. So she is, you know, covering this project. I feel her on the
Mhm.
book tour. So yeah, Nikki Giovanni, my fave, obviously. I'm just so happy that she was a part of this project, and you know, is part of, you know, her legacy now.
Yes, and I love that. And it's like she gave you her stamp of approval. I love that. I
Hmm.
love that so much. I had to show this so y'all can see. A lot of times I don't wear t-shirts, but I had to have my bookish t-shirt on today just
Yes, very on theme.
so I can celebrate. So in this book, it's broken down into sections where you are talking about the history of Black bookstores, but also breaking it down by region. So, what was it that led you to want to? Because I mean, there are a lot of ways I'm sure you could have structured the book. What was it that made you decide to kind of break it down by the different regions
Mhm.
versus, alphabetically or chronologically?
So when I pitched the book, I described it as a road trip companion to Black bookstores in the United States. And I wanted people to be able to say, hey, I'm going to Philadelphia next week. Let me look up to see what Black bookstore is there, what Black bookstores have been there. And I wanted to organize it that way so it can be actionable as well. And I've seen that happen already. People were telling me, like, oh, this is a green book. Like, I know where to go.
Yes.
The bookstores now. So it's working in that way. But then within the chapters and within those sections, it is organized chronologically, so you can
Mhm.
see what was here before, what's going on now. So you can kind of take that journey through space and time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, it is an amazing gift. Thank you so much. And yes, so with that being the case, you start kind of up north, northeast,
Mhm.
Harlem areas, New York specifically, and the first Black bookstore. Tell us a little bit about that. I found that pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so the first Black bookstore, D. Ruggles Books, was founded and owned by David Ruggles in New York City. He was an abolitionist. He wrote anti slavery publications, abolitionist works, and he printed them in his own print shop. And he even helped free Frederick Douglass and other fugitive slaves. And he was, um, now he's celebrated as the father of stateside Black bookstores. But at the time, he was persecuted, he was jailed, his store was set on fire in a suspected case of arson. Um, when we think about contraband in the United States, we often think about alcohol or drugs or guns. But what David Ruggles shows us is that for Black people in the United States, the contraband has been books the entire time. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what he was doing was illegal. He was freeing bodies on the Underground Railroad, but he was also freeing minds. And both of those were seen as equally dangerous. And
Yes.
he sets the tone for Black bookstores in the United States for being sites of liberation. And so when you go throughout Prose, you see that time and time again, Black bookstores being at the vanguard of social movements. So with David Ruggles, you have the abolitionist movement, but you also have the civil rights movement. You have the Black Power movement. You have the Black arts movement, and you have the movement for Black lives. But he really sets the tone for it.
He definitely does. And just the theme, as you said, arson, what happened with his space, that's a theme that we see throughout as well. Black bookstores being targeted because they are points of liberation. Whether it's in the title or not, there are some bookstores that are actually called that, I'm thinking of the Reparations Club, just different places where maybe it's something in the name in and of itself that might give certain people pause, but just in general, because these places and spaces aren't just about the books. The books are kind of the hook that gets people in, but there's so much more that's happening in these spaces.
Right. They're gathering places. A lot of the times they were the safe spaces during rebellions in the city. So rebellions in Buffalo, rebellions in Detroit, in DC. There are spaces where the community came together communally and learned and grew. And I think that's what people saw as a threat.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, we know it's still a threat, which is why we are dealing with the banned books. We're dealing with things being taken out of schools and anything to try to keep people from learning and getting access to the real history. One of the things, of course, in the earliest days, the books would have been things that were more independently published. Wouldn't have been, like nowadays, people can go to have the option of going quote unquote traditional publishing or going independent. At this time, it would have been specifically independently published because there weren't going to, larger publishing houses weren't going to publish Black books.
Yeah, so we see that shift in the 90s where Terry McMillan is so popular and so mainstream that the big publishers are saying like, what are those Black books over there?
Right.
And the Black bookstores, who primarily were the outlets for these authors to get their words out, are now competing with, a bookstore called Brantano's, which was popular in DC. And their stories time and time again, talking to these booksellers, saying that, the white person would come into the store with a pen and paper, write down some titles. Next week, they have a display of Black books in their store. And so that competition is there. And we see that now with Amazon undercutting the prices of books and making it harder for independent bookstores, especially Black bookstores, to stay afloat. But it's been happening for decades.
Been happening for decades. And it's just thinking about that, the importance of the fact that people were telling their own stories and publishing them themselves, that is so powerful, because I think there's so much that we can learn, and people can tell the truth in maybe ways they can't if they're being published elsewhere, because people will try to whitewash or the stories and things like that. And in some cases, maybe things that were in the books might have been considered quote unquote subversive just because it was anti-establishment or telling the truth and things like that.
Yeah, and speaking of David Ruggles having a print shop, a lot of the bookstores that came about around the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, they also had presses and their own way of getting their message out. So I'm thinking about Marcus Books in Oakland, the Black Book in Baltimore, Drum and Spear had a press. So they were concerned about being able to directly get their messages out, bring in talent that the other publishing houses would not bring on. So there's an essay about Eloise Greenfield and how she tried to get published, and then Drum and Spear published her. And of course, we know that she went on to have a great career as a children's book author.
Right.
And Paul Coates and I, who was the founder of the Black Book, also the founder of Black Classic Press, a former Black Panther and Ta-Nehisi Coates' father, we speak about what it means to be able to get your message out there without the middleman, without having your message, like you said, possibly diluted or whitewashed. And so we see a lot of those, what we call movement bookstores, focusing on that. And even Liberation Bookstore in Harlem, the owner Una Molzak, she talked about being kind of having anxiety around the fact
Mm-hmm.
that books from the 1960s, when this boom of people putting their own stuff out, they were out of print and hard to come
Mm-hmm.
by because those major publishers were closing ranks around who gets to say what, and then some of those movement bookstores had closed by then.
Yes, that is something that we see a lot in Prose to the People. These dynamic stores who, as we said, they were doing much more than selling books. They were publishing, they were helping people learn how to read in some instances for those who couldn't. Sometimes, they may have been giving books away instead of selling them because they just wanted to get the word out. And just to see that kind of, in many cases, them kind of fade away as time moved on, in whatever the areas may be. But another common theme I found in Prose to the People is that, say there is a store that's doing really great and doing really well, and then over time it fades away. There are other people who are watching along the way. They,
Absolutely.
they learn and they're like, oh, I'm going to pattern what I'm doing after so and so, but put my own
Hmm.
spin on it.
Yeah, and I think that's what being an institution is, right? So just because one store in one city closes, yes, it's very sad, and the people in that community, there is a loss there, but it goes on. It's an institution. One bookstore isn't going to stop the institution of the Black bookstore. And so, yeah, we see many times, like for Drum and Spear, for example, in Washington D.C., there are a couple of bookstores that you say we're in the tradition of Drum and Spear. So there was Pyramid Books that came on. I want to say 6 or 8 years after that bookstore closed in the same area, same neighborhood. And then there's also Caribou Books, and now one of the booksellers that was in Drum and Spear in the 60s has a bookstore in the Bay Area of California. And so, she's carrying on the tradition herself, even though she was part of that tradition, in the original one. So I love to see that there's going to be so many people inspired by the bookstores that are currently here. And even if they close or go completely online or whatever iterations there are, there's always going to be someone else that's coming on to, hold that baton and then move it forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, in New York specifically, of course, we already talked about Harlem, and we know we would have the Harlem Renaissance and just so many things going on there. So I love that the book kind of starts in that part of the country, and
Hmm.
we can see a lot of these authors coming out. And again, it's not just the fact of them writing the books and having them available in the stores. It's also the opportunity for them to go and speak, so people can like meet them and get their book signed and all these things that we may do now, but that kind of stuff was happening a long time ago as well.
Yeah, and one of the booksellers that I love the most is Louis Mishaw in Harlem. He had
Yeah.
National Memorial African Bookstore. It was Malcolm X's home bookstore. So when you see those pictures of Malcolm X on the streets in Harlem, he's often right in front of National Memorial African Bookstore. But again, he's one of those booksellers, and it's one of those stores that spurred a lot of other stores and inspired other stores. He was very generous with his advice. People travel to him to either get books from him or just shadow him to see what he did. And during the time that he was around, Harlem was packed with bookstores. They were like across the street, right beside each other. I was like, dang, how can y'all have all these bookstores? But yeah, there are booksellers who would stand out in front of his store and be like, well, come to my store because we're doing
Right.
this other thing. But I think it works because they focused on what they were really good at. There
Mm-hmm.
were metaphysical bookstores. There were bookstores that focused more on research and academics. There are bookstores that were movement bookstores. So everyone had their niche, and everyone was kind of friendly and worked together in that way. And I really loved Harlem during that time. If I could time travel, I would definitely be on 120.
Yes. Yes. I love that because I know when I went to Harlem, I felt that way. Because, of course, it's different now. Harlem has changed.
Hmm.
But, just to think about what it would have been like to be in that time, or, to maybe, be able to go into someone's store or go to a literary salon or whatever the case
Hmm.
may be, see and be able to hear just these people with their ideas, and not just telling, quote unquote story, but also in many ways just speaking truth to power, because they've researched, they've lived, they understand all these different concepts, and they're able to come and then share what they've learned with others.
Yeah, and I think having a relationship with your bookseller was something that I also found during the
Hmm.
research for Prose to the People. Because some people come in and they want to read like the tabloidy stuff.
Yeah.
And the bookseller, I think, does a great service when they're like, okay, here you go. Come back next time. And next time they give them something a little more substantive, something that's talking about what's going on in your neighborhood, what's going on in the world. And then you can see these people learning and growing. And but just really meeting people where they are is so important. And that's what I learned from a lot of the booksellers is that's how you get people interested in reading and understanding the importance of educating yourself.
Yes. And that is powerful there, when you can get to build a relationship. And that's something, you're not going to have it with the big box stores. You're not going to necessarily have that with the online sellers, except maybe with you, because I know that there's something that you do, that you curate books for people through your store. But I mean, in general, it's not something that you're really going to get. Because I mean, yeah, we might give you a suggestion based upon something that you bought before, but
Mhm.
it's not the same as sitting and having a conversation and like, hey, Katie, I think this would be a good next book for you to read based upon this, whatever the situation is. Now,
Right.
speaking of research,
Mhm.
what was your research process like? Because you talk about a lot of stores in here. Of course, you couldn't talk about them all because the book would be this thick, but of the ones that you were able to research, and then of course mention others. What was your process like in really getting to know about all the history of Black bookstores?
I'd say it was twofold. So for the bookstores that either are still open or they're closed, but the people who were there are still alive, I was able to talk to them and record those conversations and really capture the oral history of what was going on in the store. So you'll hear I'm asking questions like, what did it smell like? What music was playing? What were y'all talking about? I really wanted to immerse people into the stores, especially for the ones that we can't visit anymore.
Right.
And then I also went to different archives. So I was at the Emory Rose Library here in Georgia. They have an amazing archive. They have Daphne Muse papers, Daphne Muse being a bookseller at Drum and Spear in the 1960s. They have a lot of Pearl Clegg's papers, Pearl Clegg being the daughter of the founder of the Shrine of the Black Madonna.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so having that information locally was a game changer for me. But then I also traveled to Harlem to the Schomburg. I was at Chicago at the Newberry Library, just getting all these pieces, and it's so spread out. So the librarians there were so helpful. I let them know I was coming and hey, I'm doing this project. Can you help me out? And I found out about when I was talking about the picture of Walter Mosley, I found out about Glenderlyn Johnson and her bookstore because I just was telling the people at the Schomburg what I was doing, and they pulled me aside and whispered like, "Hey, we
Okay.
we we acquired this thing. Not supposed to tell you, but go forth and find out what you can." So
Right.
the oral histories and then the deeper research into the archives was my research process.
And you mentioning archives really brings up a thought for me. The fact that there were even archives to go to.
Hmm.
I think it's important that as Black people and our families and things like that, that if you have things that are you can share, find a way to share them, find a way to put those things aside, because that is our history in those letters, in those um, promotions for a book talk, or whatever it is. That's our history. And if we just kind of set those things in a box, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. They can disappear, and there's nothing for us to go back to and really glean some of this history from.
Yeah, it's so important. There's so many things that are just missing from the archive because no one thought to save them. And that's why it was important to me in the design of Prose to People for it to be jam packed with pictures and ephemera, because I want people to see it and to kind of experience what I was experiencing while I was going through the archive. I'm like, oh my gosh, look at this flyer from this
Mm-hmm.
event in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also part of the thought process, like showing people the archive and maybe inspiring them to hold on to some of their things or to share it with others.
Because I mentioned Tina McElroy Ansa earlier on. She passed away last year, and I had an opportunity to actually go to her memorial service.
Mm.
And so they are starting an archive of some of her things. So,
Oh, good.
able to see some of her first drafts and just other things that she was working on. So they just, they don't just disappear. So we have a lovely comment. Wow, Katie is so brilliant. Heard about Prose in the New York Times and Washington Post. It really is a must buy. It is. It is. If you're a lover of Black books, Black bookstores, Black culture, all of that, Black history, because all of these things are wrapped up in the book. Now, in addition to, you going out and meeting people and archives, going through the archives and writing, you also do have some of the interviews and some like little short essays and things by others, which I think adds even more value to the book, just hearing some stories in people's own words.
Yeah, I really wanted Prose to the People to feel like a Black bookstore. So with the design, I wanted it to be vibrant. When you go into a Black bookstore, you see all the covers, the art, but also when you go into a Black bookstore, you're not just hearing from one author, you're hearing from a lot of authors. There's a diversity of thought. So it's really important for me to include other people who had their own relationships with certain Black bookstores or their own expertise about a specific history, a specific part of history that has to do with Black bookstores. And yeah, I love it. I think every contributor is so amazing. From the poems to the interviews to the essays, like there's different genres in the book. Like it's a lot going on, but that's what a Black bookstore feels to me. So vibrant, so many wonderful, amazing writers and opinions. So that's what Prose had to be.
Yes. And if you all listen to the audio, there are multiple voices. Tell us about that. That was pretty exciting.
Yeah, that was a surprise to me, actually. I was like, oh, thank you. I don't have to read this whole book. Shout out to voice actors because it was so difficult. I was like, whoo, let's take a break. But yeah, there's a couple of different voice actors, including myself in the audiobook version. I think that just goes to this how many people who were involved in this project. And yeah, I think it makes a fun listening experience hearing the different voices. And there's male, female, and then older, younger. So we were trying to capture it all.
Yes, that was really good because a lot of times what I end up doing is like I read some and then I listen to some, and when I was listening, I'm like, oh, okay. I wasn't expecting that, but it's really good. And as you said, it brings in that diversity of voices, just as there's diversity of thought in the book. So I do love that. So now, of course, I mentioned that the book is broken down into regions, and we kind of start in the Northeast. I found it interesting that DC was a section all by itself. So what makes DC so special in terms of Black bookstores?
Yes, I put the DMV as the section because I think it definitely has its own flavor. And a lot of the bookstores that were in DC, they might have had an offshoot in Maryland or Virginia. So yeah, Drum and Spear being the preeminent Black bookstore in the 1960s. And then it has such a clear lineage of bookstores who their owners were customers of Drum and Spear or were inspired by Drum and Spear in some way. So I wanted to, put that as its own section.
Yes, because I'm like, okay, DC. I mean, we know Black Mecca. I have to say it with a question nowadays, but at one point, absolutely. So there would have been, and then I think DC has something even more special from the perspective of it being the nation's capital. So there's going to be a whole lot of politics and all sorts of things going on in DC that might not be happening in other areas. So
yeah, a lot of moving parts. Of course, the FBI was headquartered is headquartered in Washington D.C. So the bookstore Drum and Spear that was there was right in Hoover's FBI's backyard. And they were actually founded the same year that Black bookstores were added to the FBI's COINTEL program, that being the counterintelligence program where they were surveilling Black bookstores, Black activists, Black politicians. And so we see the effects of that on Drum and Spear. And of course, there's effects of that on other bookstores that are not in Washington, D.C., but they got the brunt of it just because they were so close. You could literally walk down the street and be at Drum and Spear, ripping books off the shelves, flooding the store. So that was definitely an element of the DC experience.
Because I know one of the booksellers you mentioned, she's like, the FBI was like, I'm so-and-so, give me a call. She's like, yeah, okay.
Right. Yeah. Like, you think I'm gonna call you, please?
Right. But I mean, again, it speaks to the whole thing that even though we're talking about a lot of things in historical context, we're seeing it now. It just shows up differently. Back to the whole thing of the bans and, all these sorts of things, taking education away. It's like, on a larger scale, people or the government are looking to take things away, but this is something that the Black bookstores have historically done. They have historically not just been a space just to go and get books, but to talk about different ideas and maybe say some things that people aren't going to want to have said and things like that. So that's what to me makes them so powerful versus just going into any other mainstream store, just buying a couple of books and getting a coffee and walking out. This is something so much more. They were community centers.
Absolutely. And I think also with what's going on with the book bans now, we can look at the stories and prose of the people and learn so much from our ancestors, so much from our elders, because it might have not been a specific book ban, but they were trying to ban the whole project. They've been trying to ban reading, Black writing, Black publishing, Black archiving from the very beginning. So when we see what our, foremothers and fathers have gone through, we kind of have directions on, okay, this is what they did. This is what they were going through. This is what we're going through. How can we apply the lessons and then keep it moving forward? I think one of the most important parts of these book bans and what Black bookstores throughout history have shown us is that, first of all, we're not complying with these book bans. You're not going to throw us in jail for reading Malcolm X, for reading Maya Angelou. So we're going to keep them on the shelves. We're going to keep reading them together. And we're going to learn from these people. And we're going to keep it going. And then we're going to write our own stories. We're going to publish our own stories. So I think that's so important. And that's what I got from a lot of the stories in Prose to the People, is that just because they're saying, hey, we don't want you doing this, doesn't mean we have to listen.
Yeah, we absolutely do not. I like this comment from Aaron. Katie, you be dropping gems like you robbed the jeweler. That is funny, and true. I told y'all it was juicy at the beginning because I mean it's just so much more. Now, of course, BGC Book Club, Brown Girl Collective, is about centering Black women and Black women's stories. What I loved is, yes, there are great Black men who started bookstores and did what they do, and I love to see that because, as I mentioned, my dad was the one who made me become a lover of books, so I love that. But I also love that both historically and presently there are so many Black women who are opening up bookstores and creating these spaces. Sometimes, they may have a certain niche or whatever in the way that they're creating the stores. So just tell us about a couple of the historical people, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about the ones that are doing it now.
Yeah, so one person who comes to mind is Una Molzak, who was in Harlem. She had Liberation Bookstore. She also had another bookstore in Guyana. Yes. And she's very unique in that way. She was on 2 different continents having bookstores. She moved back to the United States when she saw the anti-war movement gaining steam, and she wanted to be around and being able to provide books in that way. But what I love about her store is that she focused on small presses and then also books from the international perspective. And so her store, you would hear about what's going on in the Caribbean. You would hear about what's going on the continent. It wasn't just United States focused. And so she was a powerful bookseller. And then when her store closed, they actually gave the rest of her remaining inventory to another woman-owned bookstore that was in Harlem that was coming up. So I think going back to being a good elder, passing the baton in a way that we're keeping the project going, even if one bookstore closes, it doesn't stop the whole institution. So she's one that comes to mind. And then one that's a little bit more recent is Black Books Plus. So
Mm,
that's the store that Walter Mosley is standing out in front of. I loved reporting on that story. She's one of the booksellers that I think people don't talk about as much. She's very quiet. She's not online. She's
mm-hmm.
not like a huge personality outwardly, but she
Right.
does have a huge personality once you get to know her. And so she had the funniest stories. She's talking about beefing with Jesse Jackson when he came to the store.
Right, I remember that.
Um, but she wasn't, I don't think people would consider her a super political store, but I got the opportunity to, like I said, go through her archive, and she showed me a letter from an incarcerated customer.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said was, my body may be in prison, but my mind is free. And
Come on.
that's what those books were doing for him. And so her providing those books to incarcerated people, I think was so important. And also a larger theme that we see throughout Prose to the People is Black booksellers making sure that those who are on the inside are still in communication and in community with those of us who are on the outside.
Mm-hmm. And that is definitely something from the book that, I mean, I know that it happens, and nowadays so much is going on in terms of being able to send stuff to the prisons and stuff like that. But at that time, because a lot of times that's the first time that people are really picking up books and reading, is when they, they have that time and they're really learning and, getting degrees, whether it's a physical degree or just because they've read so much and learned so much. So I think it's really wonderful to see that the Black bookstores have done that in supporting, the people who are on the inside, as well as doing things for children, and making sure that people would have opportunities to have like a home library. Because some people, everybody can't buy a book necessarily, but to be able to have someone that's maybe donating books or, passing books along in that way, that's really powerful as well, just to get that, to begin to love to read and understand the importance of learning and growing in that way. I really could appreciate that.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we see it in so many ways, like whether it's folks who are incarcerated, or even I've seen with the stores that are close to an HBCU, the college students coming in, and they're in these centers of learning, but sometimes you want to be off campus and in community with people that way. So being able to see that firsthand has been really cool for me too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, which makes me think, well, I was going to wait to say this, but speaking of 44th and 3rd, which is here in Atlanta,
Right.
my friend Rosie Lee, she's in the room somewhere. She and I are going to be having a conversation on May the 24th at 44th and 3rd, which is a
Hmm.
Black woman-owned store here in Atlanta, and it is down in the Atlanta University Center. So that's a good example. I know they have a lot of students that work there and things like that. So.
Yeah, that was the one I was thinking of. So I'm glad you said that.
Yes, yes. So yeah, that was a little plug. I gave it a little earlier than I was going to, but yes. But yes, I mean, and not just there, in other areas as well. So that's one of the Black woman-owned bookstores. But I love there's one that like focused on food and books, and like
Yes, isn't that such a good idea?
I love it.
Yeah, so that's BIM. They're in Brooklyn. There's two sisters, Gabrielle and Danielle, and they do Black food writing. And you would think that means like cookbooks, but there's so much food writing and other types of books. There's
Yes.
memoirs where, a tough conversation happens at the dinner table. There's poetry. There's so many ways that Black food writing appears in our stories. But that's what they're focused on. And so, yeah, I love that store. I was like, this is such a good idea. And their events are so good because there's usually food involved. So
Yes.
who doesn't love that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like you said, cookbooks, memoirs, we're seeing a lot more food memoirs. And the reality of it is, how many events do we have that there's not some kind of food? Usually, if there's no food, people aren't going to stay that long. So,
Right. Like,
I mean,
we'll see y'all later.
yeah, we see you later. Like, it was fun, but I got to go. I'm hungry. So I love that idea. And then, of course, those bookstores that may be geared towards children as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really cool is that you see the evolution of children's books being included because maybe it's like hard for us to think about now, but a bookstore, they didn't often have like a robust children's section.
Mhm.
And so you go from, no children's section to The historical stores, like, okay, let's include children. Like, it's really important because it is so important to get children reading early and not saying like, oh, this is something the adults do or this is something a grandparent does. Like, no, you can do this too, and you're going to learn and grow. And you'll start with the board books and the picture books, but then you're going to go to the chapter books. That's what they called it when I was a kid.
Right.
I feel like now they call it YA, but the chapter books, and then you'll start reading your novels. And seeing that growth, I think, is really cool with kids. And as someone who loves kids and is around kids now, I'm like, okay, what book y'all reading? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
42nd Third has a really good children's book section too.
Yes, yes. And Brave and Kind, which we were at a couple of weeks ago, they had the Black Girl Book Fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have, that's all, I think mostly children's, like children's, young adults, and then some adult books. But yeah, I think it's so important to like focus on children because Malik from Malik Books in LA, he has a famous quote, children are 100% of our future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that speaking of the book fairs, I loved seeing that you and several of the Black woman-owned bookstores here in the Atlanta area decided to come together, because oftentimes it's a thing, kind of like you talked about back in Harlem, where people were like, hey, I got this kind of book, come over here. Looking at how do we work together and not look at it as being that we're in competition with one another.
Yeah, and I think the book fair that we had in Atlanta is a really good example of that because there were so many people there. It was so fun. And if we all tried to do it separately in our own little part of town, that many people wouldn't have come. And everybody was selling out, everybody was having a good time. So yeah, I love seeing that, and I'm hoping we can do that again soon, and that other cities can do that too.
Yes, and it is important for us to work together, because even in some of the cases throughout Prose to the People, there were instances where it was the community who came together, kind of having rent parties and stuff like that to help keep stores going, and just different things like that. So being able to look at it as saying, hey, we're all in this together. We all want to be educated. We all want to be informed. We all want to keep dollars in our community. All these different things that are so important, and being able to not look at others as competition or taking something away from you, and finding ways to work together. I just think that that's so powerful, just in general.
Yeah, there's definitely room for more than one Black bookstore in the same city. So working together, I think we see it time and time again, produces dividends that, being super, in competition with each other, it doesn't.
It doesn't. And I've heard the authors say the same thing. There's people can read more than one book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Hope you're not just reading one.
Yeah, there's room for more than one. And yes, Rosie Lee, I look forward to our talk as well. Thank you so much. Now, with all of the things one more I had to mention. It was a special type of store that I've never seen before, the Sister Sci-Fi vending machines.
Oh yeah,
that's pretty
cool
unique.
One. Yeah, so they're out in Oakland.
Okay.
They have vending machines. They say they're in cyberspace and Oakland.
Okay.
So yeah, they're vending machines. When I went, it was in a Black-owned coffee shop, and seeing the people being excited to see books in a vending machine. And you usually think you're going to see some M&Ms, some Snickers, some hot chips. But yeah, it was really, really cool. And I think that's one way that if you can't afford to have a 2,000 square foot space, the rent on it, or to buy it outright, having a smaller footprint but still a super big impact. Because when those kids see books for them, when kids at heart see those books for them, it's really something special.
It's really something special. And as I told you before we came on, and my friend Rosie Lee can attest to it, I have all kinds of bookish ideas. I didn't realize how much of a book nerd I actually am. But, reading Prose to the People has really helped me think about ways that, to do something a little bit different, to make sure that stories are continuing to be told, that, books are getting into the hands of the people who need to see them and read them, that, that there's not just one way to do it. And so I really loved the history of all of the people that you featured in this book, as well as the people who are doing it now and coming up with different things like, who would have thought of vending machines, to put books in. So just things like that. I love it. And that's what makes your book even richer, because it's something that can spur ideas for those who are thinking of ways to give back within the communities.
Oh, I'm so glad it's spurring ideas for you. I'm excited to see what you do, your bookish idea. Um, but yeah, there are so many ways. I also included a couple of libraries in the book, like the Free Black Women's Library, where you can't buy anything from there, but you have to swap and trade. And it's a whole beautiful space with books all by Black women. So I think that's one way to get books in the community too. And then doing those free events that she talks about in her interview that I had with her is super accessible, in a way to be in dialogue with people that you might not otherwise be speaking to. So yeah, that's out in Bed-Stuy if you're ever by that way.
Yes, I love that. And I want to say, don't they have some other places where they do pop-ups, not just there?
Yeah, so Bed-Stuy has the brick and mortar location, but they
Mm-hmm.
have one in Atlanta. I know one in LA and a couple other places too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, for those who, I mean, let's face it, a lot of us may go for ease when it's time to purchase our books. So, if we're looking to be more supportive and not necessarily go for what's easy or convenient in buying books, what is a way that we can really lean into supporting some of our Black booksellers?
I think making Black bookstores a part of your, weekly, monthly routine is really important. And as we talked about in this conversation, it isn't just you coming in, get your book and leaving. They're doing wonderful events. There's Adane in Brooklyn. They are killing it with their workshops, and they do candle making and incense, and then part of your ticket is you get a book that's related to whatever you were doing. So it's
Wow.
really increasing your knowledge base, getting you around people who are interested in the same things you are. So doing something like that, looking at what talks, like you said, you're having a talk on May 24th, looking at what talks the bookstores are doing, or any other events, I think it's a really good way to support them, and then find something that you're interested in. And so it's not like, oh, I'm doing my, charity work for the day by buying a book from a Black bookstore, but you're getting something out of it and they're getting something out of it too.
Mm-hmm. And outside of shopping, what are other ways that we can lend support? Say if you're a thought leader, or someone who can add value to what may be happening at that store, at different stores.
One of the things as an author now that I don't think I was privy to before was the moderator piece. So, like you said, you're going to be in conversation with Rosie Lee. I think if you are someone who is a reader and really interested in particular topics, maybe going to your bookstore and saying, like, hey, if you have an author who's talking about, these three topics that I'm really versed in, I would love to be considered to be a moderator. I'd love to read the book. And so that's also just a way to get yourself more out there in the community and be more in community with those bookstores and then people who are going to the bookstores. Rosie Lee says yes. But that's
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I hadn't really thought of before being an author. But it's so important because, authors, they write these books, and then we want to be in conversation with people who are interested in them and, can ask us great questions like you're doing right now. So that's one maybe unique thing that you haven't heard of yet that you could, go in and, shoot your shot and pitch yourself as that.
Yes, yeah, I'm gonna do that more, do more of that, because I think that is important. And as you said, people who actually are interested in the book, that have a little knowledge, that can have a more robust type of conversation. Because even like sometimes if you go to some book fairs that might be more, let's just say general, I find that the people who may be asking the questions, or the people that are sitting on the panels, don't really bring the cultural awareness to the
Mhm.
conversations, and that may make it more challenging for even for the author who's wanting to have a good conversation and really dive into the meat of what they've written.
Yeah, you want someone who, like you said, read the book, is interested, but then can go a little bit deeper so that the author can get their message out and so that the audience can find, say, like, oh, I'm really interested in this book. Because it's the worst when you go to a book talk and you can tell it's a good book, but you're really not getting the message across, and it gets kind of muddled. But it happens. But if we can cut down on that, I think that would be really great.
Mm-hmm. One last thing, because I know that Rosie Lee is here, and there may be other authors that are watching, or budding authors, or people who may pick up on this later. As an author or a writer, a Black writer, what is a way that they can ensure that even if their books are being traditionally published, that they can ensure that their books are getting placement in the places that they want them to be, that they're reaching the audiences that they want them to reach?
So you said if they are being traditionally published?
Right.
Yeah, so I think making sure that your sales rep knows and has a relationship with the places that you want your book to be in. And then also you as an author being in relationship with those people too. So I made sure to go around to the Atlanta stores and Decatur, which is, suburb of Atlanta, and just introduce myself, say, hey, I have a book coming out this day. This is what it's about. Here's some information about it. And you'd be surprised how that works wonders. They're like, okay, I'll order it right now. I was just in Philadelphia for a book event for Prose to the People. And I went to Giovanni's Room, which is a bookstore that is about like gay and feminist topics. And I just asked them like, oh, hey, do you have this book? I can sign it for you. They hadn't heard of my book, but they ordered it right then. It's like, oh, I know you won't be able to sign it by the time it gets here, but we want to have this book in our store. So just, putting yourself out there, going up and talking to people is, I think, one of the best ways to make sure that your book gets where you want it to be.
I love that. I love that. Now, speaking of events and things like that, I know you got a ton of stuff going on, because Prose of the People hasn't even been a month yet. It hasn't been that long.
No, not yet.
So I know you have a lot of different events coming up, so online as well as in person. So where are a few places where people can look to see you in the next few weeks?
So I will be in LA on May 17th at Reparations Club. I'll be in conversation with James Fugate, and he is the co-founder of Esalen Books, which closed in 2022, was one of the preeminent Black bookstores in LA for over 30 years. And then also Jazzy McGilbert, who is the founder and owner of Reparations Club in LA. So we'll all be talking about LA bookstores and the tradition that LA is putting on. And I will say LA was the city that surprised me the most while writing Prose to the People, because I was finding bookstores that I had never heard of. And I was like, oh, I didn't have this in the proposal, but they have to be in there. So I'm thinking about third world ethnic books. I'm thinking about Hugh Gordon Bookshop. Of course, there's Aquarian, which has an amazing story. But LA was one of the cities that I was like, wow, I didn't know there was so much Black bookstore history here. So I'm really excited for that conversation. And then on the 12th, on May 12th, I'll be in a virtual event with the Bibliographical Society of America. I'll be talking with CBS's Alvin Patrick, and our conversation will be focusing on New York. So the New York section and what Black booksellers in New York brought to the tradition of Black bookselling. And then on June 11th, I will be at the Atlanta History Center in conversation with Dr. Daniel Black. So lots of options for you.
Lots of options. And one thing I told Katie before we came on, I love it that finding out what she's got going on is easy. It's on Instagram at Good Books ATL, or her website, same thing, goodbooksatl.com. So you can learn more about places she's going to be, all of the things she's got going on, get some more insight into the book. Yes, and Rosie said, I love the ideas you're sharing. They really promote community.
Thank you.
Because at the end of the day, it's a celebration of the Black bookstores, but it's a celebration of our communities as well. It really is.
Yes, thank you for recognizing that. And you were one of the first people to say, I want to talk to you about your book months and months and months before it came out. So I appreciate you for offering this space to Black women. And, you said you're, 5 years strong. I'm sure you have an amazing archive. And I think that's so important too for future generations when they're looking back and saying like, what were these authors thinking, and what was going on during this time? It's so important. So you're doing the work now, and I'm really excited and happy to be a small part of it.
Thank you. Well, as I said jokingly on IG, we go way back. We We go back to when I didn't know your name and you knew my voice, right?
Right.
Yeah, I had to definitely support you, and I appreciate those kind words. I know this is the first of many things that I know that you're going to have going on in this world because, as you know, Aaron said earlier, you know, you are brilliant. So
Thank
I know
you.
that there is much more coming from you, and you know, don't know what that is yet, but I know it's forthcoming. We got to work on this first.
Right.
Because that's the thing. I know I talk to authors all the time, and it's like, okay, can I like talk about this book and get this one done before you're like pushing me for the next thing? So I definitely understand and can relate to that. So thank you so much. And I'm gonna let you grab some water, whatever the case may be. I'm gonna tell you who's gonna be here, the next couple of books that we'll be sharing in the book club. But I'll see you in just a second, Katie. So please
All
don't
right.
hang up just yet.
Okay.
All righty. So thank you everyone for being here for this great conversation and being able to meet Katie Mitchell and learn more about her work, learn more about Prose to the People, which, as I said, it's juicy, especially for those of you like myself who love Black bookstores, Black books, you know, a little bit of a book nerd, all that kind of stuff. You will love this and just all the history and the stories that are contained within. So as we mentioned earlier, of course, I suggest getting the book because y'all see all these tabs, right? But because of the pictures and things like that, I suggest getting a physical copy, but you can also listen just to be able to hear the stories told in different voices and things like that. So that's just my last plug for that. But in terms of who's coming up next, on this coming Wednesday, 2 days from today, we will have Angela Jackson Brown here to talk about her book, Untethered. So look for that on Wednesday, which if you're watching in real time will be May the 7th. So look for that on Wednesday. And a week from today, we will have Morgan Jerkins with her new book, Zeal, next week, which is the 12th of May. So that's what we've got for right now. Again, thank you everyone for being here, for being engaged in this conversation with Katie and I. And you all, please have a great week. And we'll see you again real soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.